Please welcome Nicole Rodriguez-Leach, Executive Director of Grantmakers for Education.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I clearly woke up feeling very energized and bright, ready to build on yesterday's conversations. And I do want to just jump right in because we were called in yesterday to stand in commitment and principle, to see the state as an important unit of analysis and action, to check ourselves, our core assumptions that philanthropy and others hold and have long held about the purpose and problems of schools. We were called in to consider a higher purpose of learning and education, one around democracy, engagement, empowerment, freedom, citizenship, and civic strength. We were called in to contrast a focus on standards with a focus on systems and support, to question the narrative of a singular truth about a failing public education, to acknowledge the genius of Black-led change, to heed the cautions of an unrenewed social contract between the public and public schools. We were called in to build our individual and collective skill and sensibility, to be hands-on, minds-on as learners ourselves with your ducks, and to remember that we're all in this together. And on this last invitation, I heard that some of you were wondering about our logo and admiring it. So I wanted to take a minute to explain. Most of you all recognize the ampersand symbol, and that infers connection, the layers representing a merging of ideas. And the person, which you may not have recognized or you may think of as the circle, that's your head. So that person, that's you, right? And that's calling us all to be present and engaged. The ampersand also represents the and. That's how we know this symbol, which in this logo denotes in an invitation to expand, to cooperate, and to explore the possibilities. I hope that you all received this year's lapel pins when you checked in. It's a new tradition for us, so if you keep coming to conferences, you'll just amass a small collection. If you didn't already, please do get one from the welcome desk. They're kind of around. But this morning, we'll continue to center education for a thriving democracy. We'll begin to forge an expansive and necessary education imaginary. And we'll do that through our dialogue and what we know about this moment in education and philanthropy, and our worries and our hopes as we look out onto the horizon. Every one of you in this room is a leader. So throughout the day, including in this session, but beyond, I invite you to think about the ways in which you engage and you lead that advance the highest ideals that you hold for education and for philanthropy. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to ask you all to help me welcome to the stage Sophie Finelli, President of the Stewart Foundation. Sophie's going to guide us through the morning with others in an exchange of ideas and conversations that really matter. So especially as to how we take action. So with that, thank you all. So excited to be here with you all today. And I'll turn you over to Sophie.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Okay, I know it's day 2. We had a party last night, but you're in for a treat this morning. As Nicole introduced me, I'm Sophie Finelli. I'm the president of the Stewart Foundation, and I'm the vice chair of the board of GFE. I'm honored to share the stage and join in conversation with our brilliant guests. Look around the room. We are joined today by Dr. Benjamin, Marcus Pope, the president of Youth Prize, and 80, I think, young people, youth leaders. I can feel the energy is different today. Youth leaders from throughout the state of Minnesota who are joining us. We have an ambitious agenda for the next 90 minutes, so buckle up. I want to start with some appreciations. First, thank you to our servers this morning and to everyone at the hotel who is supporting the conference. I also want to thank Nicole and the GFE team again for the time and care you've invested in our 3 days together and for taking us on a journey of learning and reflection. Thank you, team. And I also want to thank Kent McGuire and the participants in yesterday's plenary, which kicked off the conference theme, Education for a Thriving Democracy, Truth, Discourse, and Transformation. I'll come back to this in a few minutes. First, I want to give you a quick preview of what I hope to do in my few minutes of introduction. First, I'm going to frame the conversation as a continuation of the one led by Kent and his excellent panel yesterday. And then I want to share with you the thoughtful design that went into the planning and structure of today's conversation. I'm going to be honest, we're trying something new this morning, new for us at GFE. Not new to many of you who work with young people, but really new to the organization. And I want to thank Nicole and her vision for this. And we think it's important for everyone to pull back the curtain a little bit so you know what it takes to truly invite young people into conversation and partnership. So first, let me go back to day one. There are two takeaways that I'm sitting with this morning as we embark on day 2 of this conference. First, and Nicole said it again this morning, this is a moment where we need to disrupt and set aside business as usual. And Sarah reminded of us that yesterday. We're at an inflection point for our democracy when we as a sector really need to reflect and think and then act in new ways. Sitting on the sidelines is not an option. Second, each of us, all of us here, need to re-engage around the central purpose of education in a multiracial democracy. Dr. Allen yesterday spoke to the essential role education plays in empowering young people to be full participants in civil life and democracy. Kant asked what would be different if, quote, democratic purpose and engagement was the core and enduring purpose of education. How would that inform your current work and strategy? What would be different if you saw your work, your existing strategies, through the lens of the democratic purpose of school? I'm asking you to really engage on this topic today. This fundamental notion of engaging and empowering young people is what this morning's session is all about. And it's why Nicole and her team asked me to participate. At the Stewart Foundation, we're pretty much obsessed with the brilliance of adolescence. And we've made a very special personal and public commitment to reimagining schools and public systems so that every young person thrive, not in spite of public systems, but because of them. Because of them. So let me show a couple of slides from our recent video on adolescent thriving. So let's see if this works. Okay. This slide gives us a snapshot of the amazing period of growth and development during the adolescent years, roughly 14 to 24 years old. Similar to a child's early years, the period of adolescence is a time of incredible growth and brain development. Opportunities and experiences in adolescence have a profound impact on young people's trajectories, including their well-being as adults. That's why researchers describe it at the decisive decade. Relationships, connections, and opportunities to build life skills, to develop a sense of purpose, and make meaning from new information and experiences. This is what science tells us the period of adolescence is all about. It is a time when young people learn to navigate life, when they begin to see themselves as contributors and as leaders, and when they can grow their civic skills, knowledge, and dispositions. This notion of young people as contributors and leaders was top of mind as we planned today's session. So for today's conversation, we knew that we wanted to create a more authentic and intergenerational dialogue about re-engaging around the purpose of education. And we wanted to do so in a way that was aligned both to the science I just talked about, but also aligned to our values at GFE. So what does that mean on a practical basis? First, it means partnering with individuals like Marcus, who will be up on stage in a minute, whose organizations are authentically connected and engaged with young people. It means a willingness to invest the time in meetings between organizational leaders, Ed Funder staff, Youth Prize, and 5 partners from across the state to move beyond a transactional relationship to really co-creating and co-planning our time together this morning. It also means a financial commitment or resources from GFE. And when you work with young people, you know you have to make that financial commitment. That includes stipends for youth leaders, transportation, hotel costs, honoraria to the organizations involved, and reimbursements. That's the how behind this morning. And it's only the first step. The rest is up to us and how we show up today in conversation with young people. And for some guidance about that, I'd like to invite Marcus Pope, President of Youth Prize, who is a partner in today's session, to the stage.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, Sophie. Youth Prize and our partners are excited to be here. We are eager to hear from Dr. Benjamin and thrilled that young people have been invited to join the conversation. As Ed funders, you had an ambitious desire to engage young people in this conference, and over 70 youth have graciously accepted the invitation. Now, it's important to know that the students didn't have to use their time in this way. In Minnesota, this is a coveted and highly anticipated non-school day. To put this in perspective, young people are doing the equivalent of an adult using a full day of paid time off to discuss how to improve their workplace. Do we have any adult takers? I mention this to immediately dispel the misconception that we are somehow doing young people a favor by allowing them to be present today. The opposite is true. The students here represent a golden opportunity for adults and funders to better understand the perspectives of those most directly impacted by the decisions we make. Several partners made today a reality. I'd like to thank Nicole and her team, Kathleen, who made important connections, my Youth Prize colleagues, and our partners who supported young people in attending today. Our partners include the Brooklyn Bridge Alliance for Youth, Minnesota Seeds, Sprockets, Ignite After School, and World Youth Connect. I would like to especially thank World Youth Connect for being here today. They tragically lost one of their members, Isaiah, who was planning to be with us, but was murdered last week. I would like to hold a moment of silence in memory of Isaiah. Thank you. Again, young people are here on their day off. Many of their hearts are heavy from the loss of a friend. Others have traveled over 3 hours to get here from Worthington, Minnesota. All are dealing with the challenges of navigating today's complex society. Yet their presence here today is evidence of the fact that young people not only want to be educated and served, they also want to lead and contribute. So let's create space to maximize what they can offer us during this time. As we reflect on Dr. Benjamin's remarks at our tables, let's prioritize listening to young people and asking questions. Yes, we as adults have a lot we can and should share, but we also need to be intentional, me included, about not dominating the conversation. While holding this shared space, let's challenge each other, youth and adults. Hold each other to high expectations and be willing to explore areas outside the boundaries of what we believe may even be possible. Finally, as a takeaway from today, let's not forget these conversations with young people. And please, let it not be our last intergenerational conversation as we seek to amplify the lived experiences of young people in spaces where decisions are made on their behalf. Thank you.
Don't worry, I'm back only for a minute here. Thank you, Marcus, so much. We appreciate your guidance and partnership as we lean into a different type of engagement with young people this morning. Just as Lulit spoke yesterday of the need to, quote, dream of a time before we can see it on the panel, our keynote this morning, Dr. Benjamin, speaks and writes of the need to imagine ourselves into new, more just systems. Dr. Benjamin is a writer, educator, and professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, where she specializes in the interdisciplinary study of science, medicine, and technology, with a focus on the relationship between innovation and social inequity. In her latest brilliant book, Imagination, a Manifesto, if you don't have it, please run and get a copy. Dr. Benjamin argues that we are constrained by policies and paradigms that result from the narrow imagination of those who monopolize power and resources and that seek to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Through her work and scholarship, she urges all of us to challenge the deep assumptions and logics underpinning systems of oppression as a critical first step toward creating a world in which everyone thrives. It is my honor to welcome Dr. Benjamin to the stage.
Good morning. Wow. Okay, I'm so honored to be in conversation with y'all. Let's just jump into it because my job is to kind of be a triple espresso shot for us this early, and then we're going to get into the conversation. So one of the things that we hear a lot about is AI, right? AI is going to do a lot of things for good, for bad. And that is artificial intelligence is what we associate with AI. But what I want to suggest is that there are other types of AI that don't get a lot of attention, don't have big marketing teams behind them, don't get a lot of hype. One of which is what we might call ancestral intelligence. What does that look like? When you hear that phrase, what comes to mind for you? Maybe something your grandma taught you. Maybe something that your culture has passed down to you. But this particular AI, we don't hear a lot about. So I want us to carve out space today in our conversations to reflect on what this might involve. The other AI, in which I'm going to dive even deeper into, is abundant imagination. Now this AI, again, we don't hear a lot about. We hear about the first one on your left, but these other types of AI, in my view, are essential to radically expanding our educational imaginary, to think about what new paradigms, what new policies we need moving forward. And so I want to share a little bit about how my own thinking around imagination has evolved, and then we're going to do a little exercise. So about 15 years ago, I was starting my first job as a professor. I was trying to learn everything that I could about teaching because somehow they managed not to do that in graduate school. And I came across a famous study that was conducted by NASA that was focused on creativity. So these researchers, they were interested in measuring the capacity for what they called divergent thinking. That is the ability to see beyond what's right in front of us and come up with many different ways of thinking through a problem. So what they did was they followed a cohort of 1,600 children over many years of their life. And each year, they gave them a creativity test that was initially designed for NASA recruits. And the results that they got were shocking, in that almost 100% of 5-year-olds fell into the genius category for divergent thinking. More shocking still was that every single year that percentage dropped until 12% of 15-year-olds and 2% of adults exhibited this creative capacity. In other words, this inherent genius that we all possess is schooled out of us. The very place we should be able to go to incite our imaginations is the place where it's routinely squashed, ground down, standardized. Not inevitably, but predictably. And so it's not just individual students who end up suffering, but it's society as a whole when we don't heed Toni Morrison's words. As you enter positions of trust and power, dream a little before you think. So what if we took imagination seriously? Not as flights of fancy or as something reserved only for self-proclaimed artists, but imagination as a resource, a capacity, a muscle. How might the power of our collective imaginations begin to shape the world around us? So to explore these questions, let's try this little exercise. We're going to split the room in half. On the right side over here, your catchphrase is "be bold." And when I point to you, you got to say it in unison like you're going to shoot me like a rocket in the sky. Ready? Let's try it. Be bold. Again. Be bold. This side, your catchphrase is "get real." And I want you to say it like you're so bored and over it, okay? Ready? Together. Get real. Again, louder. Get real. Okay. So when I point to you, do your catchphrase. Ready? Space travel. Be bold. Free public transportation. Get real. Colonize Mars. Be bold. Decolonize Earth. Get real. AI superintelligence. Be bold. Cancel student debt. Get real. Build underground bunkers to survive the AI apocalypse. Be bold. Build affordable housing for all. Get real. Spend billions on weapons and war. Be bold. Invest in peace and well-being for all. You get the picture? Boldness is rationed while realism is mass-produced. Now, these futurists, they let their own imaginations run wild when it comes to bending our digital and our physical realities. But their visions grow limp when it comes to transforming our social realities so that everyone has the chance to live a good and meaningful life. We are, in many ways, trapped inside the lopsided imaginations of those who monopolize power and resources to benefit the few at the expense of the many. So how can we be bold in our social visions? For starters, I think it involves reckoning with what is distorting our vision, what is creating this lopsided reality. There are two powerful stories that we're told and that we end up telling about the future, about technology, and our relationship to it. The first story on your left is what we might call the techno-dystopian narrative, the idea that technology is going to slay us. It's going to take all the jobs. It's going to rob us of our agency as human beings, everything negative associated with technologies. And now this is the story we know that Hollywood loves to sell us, right? The Terminator, the Matrix, the list goes on. On your right is what we might call the techno-utopian narrative, the idea that technology is going to save us. It's going to make everything more efficient, more fair. If only we would hand over our decisions to automated systems, we'd be in better hands. Now, this is the story we know that Silicon Valley works 24/7 to sell us. These sound like opposing narratives. They have different endings for sure, right? One in which we're saved, one in which we're slayed. But they actually share an underlying logic. what we will call a techno-deterministic logic, which is just a fancy way of saying that we assume technology is in the driver's seat, propelled by a will of its own. It impacts us, but the humans behind the screens are missing from both of those scripts. The desires, the values, the assumptions, the ideologies, the worldviews that get encoded into our digital systems. All of that is wiped away in both of these narratives. So as a first step of expanding our educational imaginary, we have to pull back the screen. We have to recognize who and what are selling us these stories, these visions of the future, because in both we're disempowered. A touchstone for me, a go-to sort of mantra that helps me think through these issues is written by Black feminist writer Toni Cade Bambara, a different Toni this time. Not all speed is movement. We think about all of the things that we're racing towards, trying to go fast towards, both in our personal lives, our professional lives. To me, this idea we can think through. But here I want to apply it to technological speed, the race to create faster, bigger, fancier systems, and all of the things that we have to skip over to get that fast. The questions we don't ask, the communities we don't consult, the youth leaders we don't listen to as we race towards the future. There are two photos here. One on your left is from a prior era of racial domination we would associate with the Jim Crow era, in which young people at that time protested, resisted, and ultimately overthrew that system. On your right is a picture from the first few weeks of the pandemic. Remember, everybody got sent home, and people couldn't take those standardized tests that are so important. In the UK, those are called A-level exams. You need those scores in order to get into college, and higher the score, the better school you can get into. But the students couldn't take those exams. They were sent home. So what did the government do? They used an algorithm to predict those students' grades. Predictably, the students that went to more working class schools, more students of color in those schools, they got lower grades than their white, wealthier counterparts. And you see here the students had a lot to say about those algorithms. One sign in particular is very instructive. Yeah, that one. But also this one. Our grades don't equal our postal codes, or what we call zip codes, right? So this is an important formulation that she's presenting us with, because it recognizes the fact that those algorithms didn't create the problem from scratch. They are reflecting and reproducing existing forms of inequality that already exist in the geography of cities, in the way that schools and communities are segregated. And so it's important to understand that any conversation about technology has to start with society. What in the society is creating the data, creating the context in which various tools are being imagined and materialized? An important instruction for us as we move forward. Another way to think about it when it comes to, again, the first kind of AI that receives all the hype, one of the catchphrases in that context is that they're engaged in deep learning, by which people mean computational depth. But what I want to suggest is that computational depth without social and historical depth is actually superficial learning. It's not that deep. That's an invitation for us to understand that we need many kinds of knowledges in the room, around the table, making decisions. We can't leave it simply to those who have the technological know-how to create tools for a society that they have very little clue about. Think about it. People are creating tools for education, healthcare, public safety, employment, and they have an elementary understanding, a very simplistic understanding about what those institutions and areas of life even are about. And yet it's shaping what all of us then have to experience. And so what we have to develop in our pedagogy, in our educational context, is both critical and creative capacities. We hear a lot about critical thinking. We don't hear as much about creative capacities, to know what we don't want, to be critical, but what we do want, to be creative, to create those things, to uproot and to seed at the same time. And so how do we do this? Let's do a little exercise, and another one. This time you don't have to say anything, just have to look closely at these images. Again, we're trying to home our vision and look beneath the surface of what's right in front of us. Looks like a regular old bench, right? Simple park bench. This one, I took this photo in Berkeley, California, which is where I went to graduate school. But on this trip, I was living, working in Boston. It was the middle of winter. Back in California, I just was enjoying the sunshine. I was vitamin D deprived. I wanted to lay down on this bench for a few minutes between meetings, and I realized, oh, because of the way that this bench is set up, I can't comfortably lay down on it. Those armrests at regular intervals. And I thought, okay, there's all kind of functional reasons why you would have those armrests, right? Literally to put your elbows on. If you're elderly, getting up and down. When I was 9 months pregnant, it could come in handy. Maybe if a stranger's sitting on one side, you might be more likely to sit down next to them because of that invisible air wall. But my mind went to probably what a lot of y'all are thinking. Those armrests prevent people from sleeping on the bench. People who might need to. This is the Bay Area, after all. With the tech boom, the housing crisis has grown exponentially. With innovation has come greater and greater inequity. At one point, 1 in 3 school kids in Palo Alto were unhoused because of the displacement. So I thought, okay, well, this is a growing issue. There's a lot of businesses around here. Maybe they just don't want people who are unhoused in their line of sight. So I did a little digging, and I found, okay, this is one version of it. Let me look at a few other places. I found single occupancy benches in Helsinki. No lying down there, only one booty at a time. I found caged benches in France. In this case, the mayor installed these on Christmas Eve, but within 24 hours, the people in the town rallied together and had them removed. Which reminds us we don't simply have to submit or click submit to discriminatory designs. But my favorite example is the metered bench that has spikes built into the structure. You pay the meter, the spikes go down for about 15 minutes. So don't get lost in your favorite Harry Potter book. Those spikes are going to come back up. Now, you'll be relieved to know that this was originally designed by a German artist to get us to think critically about how public space is designed to keep some people out, some people in, but how it also applies to public policy, how something can be nominally for everyone, but because of the way it's designed, it has these forms of harm and exclusion built in beneath the surface. And so if we think with the bench, apply it to other areas of our life, we can ask, what are the spikes beneath the surface, where something looks like it's inclusive for everyone, but decisions have been made so that only those who can afford it, let's say, can really benefit. And so I want you to ponder this again, another question for the table. What are the spikes that you've witnessed in your classrooms, in your schools, in your communities? But don't just be critical about it, that is pointing out the spikes. Ask yourself, how could it be designed differently? If not this, then what do we want it to be? And so if we think with this idea of the bench, I want to suggest that there's more obvious harms, right? But I think we can do better than the obvious. Like this bench from South Africa, right? The exclusion is in our face. It doesn't take a lot of rocket science to figure out who's included, who's excluded. But I think we can look even deeper, where something can look very welcoming and inclusive on the surface, but the underlying structure hasn't changed that much. All the right buzzwords, all the right glossy photos on the websites, but you get there and it's business as usual. So here we want to develop the capacity to look beneath the surface, to look at the insidious harms, and exclusions that persist even when we're presenting a very welcoming surface, a superficial veneer. So I want us to practice this exercise of looking even deeper with one example here from education. Now, this is from a study that was conducted by some colleagues at Yale. They put eye tracking technology on preschool teachers. And they said, look at the kids playing, and they said, look for the challenging behavior. The vast majority of the teacher's attention went to the little black kids in the playgroup, even though they were behaving the same way as all the other kids. They were hired child actors instructed on how to behave. And yet, when primed to look for the challenging, i.e. bad or deviant behavior, people's attention went to those pint-sized little black bodies in the room. Profiling in childhood that we see in adulthood. So this is what we might call an obvious spike. Those of us who've been on the receiving end of that gaze, where we've been looked at as bad or deviant or dumb, we can see it coming a mile away. It's obvious to us, at least. The challenge becomes, again, the more insidious spikes in education that are often peddled through technologies that are sold to us as beneficial, as good for young people. In this case, something called the Student Success Predictor Score that's used in over 500 colleges and universities to predict whether a student is going to drop out. So they label young people low, medium, and high risk with the idea, at least, that we'll intervene early with those high-risk students so they don't drop out. In reality, what it does is it gives adults in these institutions reason to steer young people out of challenging majors, for example, because as this audit found, black students were labeled high risk at quadruple the rate of their white peers, and black students in STEM fields even higher risk. So you can imagine a young person coming into the office, you pull up their record, you see that high risk there, they're in computer science, they're in biology. You want to graduate, you know, maybe you should consider switching. I'm not racist, but that's what the computer is telling me. In my view, if we're going to use these kind of labeling tools that further stigmatize students as high risk, why not turn it in the direction of those who are producing the risk? But we don't do that. We are quick to say, oh, this risk score is going to benefit the students. Oh, if it's so beneficial, let us judge which departments are high risk. Let us decide which fields are high risk. We never point it in the direction of those who have the power to actually shape the context in which people have to navigate, which belies the idea, you know, that, okay, if it must not be that beneficial. You don't want to get labeled high risk, but you're quick to label young people high risk. So this is an insidious spike, and it applies not just with this particular technology, but so many other areas of our educational and wider systems. It's what I term the new Jim Code. Because in the Jim Crow era, like my grandma, she would have gone to school and seen that this is a colored school. The spikes would have been in her face like that bench from South Africa. Now, my kids, my sons are in their early 20s, when they were going to school, they had all kinds of little algorithms helping them decide which colleges they were eligible for, which things they should do. No one had to be outwardly racist, but because of how these systems are trained, they are going to be steered towards certain schools, certain fields. And it's this encoded inequity that I term the new Jim Code. And because we imagine it as more objective than that old school type of racism. How do we move forward? As a starting point, what we're doing this morning, listening to learners. In this case, we see a group of students in Brooklyn staging a walkout in their school because the school had adopted an online program in which they were behind tablets for the majority of the week. They got like 15 minutes time with their teacher each week. And they thought, this is not education. This is not learning. And so they revolted, as they should. Or like this entire town in Kansas, the students, the teachers, the parents, all revolted against an educational, a tech software that was creating all kinds of issues, kids with disabilities getting headaches, vomiting, you know. No one consulted these families. No one consulted the students before just buying the hype that they're being sold through these ed tech platforms. It goes beyond just schools and education. What we're doing in the context of education is a laboratory for engendering the capacity to think critically and creatively in our lives in general, because these technologies are not just impacting education. I could have a whole talk on healthcare. I could have a whole talk on policing, on workplace algorithms. And so what we're doing in the educational context is developing the capacity for young people to go out into the world and be able to see the spikes and imagine how things could be differently as they go into these, and they're already doing this in the context of surveillance technologies, as this image shows. Refusing to even apply to jobs at certain companies that have contracts with immigration enforcement or policing or military. And so one way to think about the capacity that we're trying to develop in terms of our educational imaginary is that we want to hone pedagogies of educational dignity. Dignity and respect, by which I mean dignity that recognizes the power of students to read the world, make meaning, and act with intention and efficacy. This is a screenshot of students in my own lab that were profiled again in this Boston Review piece, if you want to dive in to see kind of some of the work that they're doing. All I want to point out here is, although the headline is focusing on that critical lens, that what they're combating, Peyton and Kania, these two students who you see here, they're both not just technologists, but they're artists. Peyton designs fashion. Kania is a fiction writer. And so, again, thinking about braiding these two things, being able to code, being able to be critical of that code, but also being able to create what you actually want in the world, not just know what you don't want. This is really the imagination that we want to hone. And so as a final thought is this. When we talk about the way forward, it can seem kind of bleak when you start to notice how entrenched, endemic, insidious the new Jim Code is in our everyday life. But the fact is, if inequity is woven into the very fabric of our society, that means that each twist, each coil, each code is a chance for all of us to weave new patterns, practices, and politics. That means the vastness of the problems that we're up against will be their undoing once we accept that we are pattern makers. We're not just affected by systems, we are systems. Our decisions, our habits, our choices, the way that we organize collectively can transform the status quo. We haven't just inherited these outmoded ways of thinking and doing things. We are protagonists. We can actually change it for the better as we pass things down to the next generation. So, speaking of next generation, this is really, really my final thought, and I'm gonna shut up. This is me embodying my little girl, B-girl phase. And now I'm a B-girl in another sense, in that during the pandemic, my family and I, we started raising bees in our backyard. And so I've learned a lot about bees. Those of you who read the Imagination book, you're gonna hear about the bees at the end. And so I could geek out and tell you all of the things I learned, but I'm just gonna point out one lesson that I've learned from these little tiny creatures that don't let their smallness get in the way of what they're doing. They're buzzing around in my backyard right now, filling those hives with sweetness. They're also ready to sting you if you get too close. So that's one little lesson, is we need both the sweetness and the stings. But the bigger lesson is this. The bees in my backyard right now are working hard to fill those hives with the resources that are needed for the hive to survive the winter. And the winters get kind of iffy in Jersey. But those bees that are working right now, their lifespan is too short to survive the winter. They're not going to actually make it through the season. So they're filling it with sweetness and sustenance, not for themselves, but for the next generation. That is intergenerational solidarity. It's recognizing that someone created the sustenance that is keeping you alive right now. You owe it to the next generation to do the work, even though you are not going to benefit directly from doing that work. This is what we might say is being visionary in the corniest way possible. And one other way to think about this is you all have heard that mantra that we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. You've heard that before. I think an even better way to think about it, a question that we should ask ourselves, daily, weekly, monthly, is are we our descendants' wildest dreams? Are we doing the work to ensure that our descendants are filled with what they need, not just to survive the winter, but to truly flourish, to have their potential be exercised in the world, and not just to navigate it, survive it, but to transform it. So with that, thank you for your attention. Enjoy your table talk. I look forward to your questions.
So I have some instructions for you all. First, can you join me in thanking Dr. Benjamin for this really inspiring remarks. Hopefully at your tables you have young leaders. Can I see hands up, young leaders? Young people in the room, raise your hands. Okay. So the adults know if you don't have young people at your table and you want to be in conversation with a young person, you can move. This is your cue. You can switch table, or you can speak among yourselves. Sorry, I have light in my face. At your table, you have a little card like this, reflections. We have some prompts there to kind of get the conversation going. You don't have to follow the prompt. But the questions include what resonated with you, what are you wondering, what questions or assertions do you have for Dr. Benjamin? So you have about 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes for conversations. So the floor is yours. Have some conversations, and then we'll get into a Q&A in a little bit.
Perfect.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. Okay. I think we're back to be in conversation with Dr. Benjamin. And so I think there are some GFE staff in the room with the mics. Can you raise your hands so we can see you? Okay, so who is the courageous young person here who's going to ask the first question? And over there, okay.
So my question for you was, what do you think makes it hard for students in this upcoming generation to be able to understand those more underlining ideas? Was that clear enough?
Totally. Thank you for that question. You know, it is a question that I think is best answered by you, by young people. That is, knowing what is distorting, what is narrowing, what is distracting from being able to do that deeper analysis and sort of, think through other possibilities for how things are. I don't necessarily think it's harder for your generation than anyone else. Like, in some ways, in terms of my own engagement, I get to hang out with 18 to 22-year-olds the rest of my life, right? That's like in my job description. And I find that oftentimes they're coming to the table with a keen understanding. They might not have all the fancy language around it, but an understanding of things that are being sold to them versus reality, right? So even something as simple as like filtering, like your photo filtering on social media, right? That's a way of distorting reality that we all have access to. We can make ourselves look, sun-kissed, or less wrinkles, or different hairstyles. Like, just that filtering exercise we can see it as distorting, but we can also see it as creative, like it's a way of playing with what is, right? Depending on what our goals are in doing that. So I think that you come to the table, my experience at least teaching, is with an intuition and a sort of perspective that there's more than one way to look at things, right? But then the challenge is like how to diagnose that, name it precisely so that we can do something about it. And so that's like the next level, is like to take that dis-ease, to take that intuition and hone it, to get it, sharpen it, so that you can actually cut through the bullshit, right? Both with your language, with your choices. And so it's not a matter of like not having that ability, but it's sharpening it, and then also understanding that once you diagnose something and you say, okay, this ain't right, whatever this is, not stopping there. The challenge is, especially in academia, less so perhaps in K through 12, but certainly in higher ed, we spend a lot of time and vocabulary naming what's wrong with the world, at least in the humanities and social sciences. But we don't carve out enough space to ask that next question, which is, now what? Now what do we do? Now that we understand this is wrong, this is not functioning, this is harming. Because oftentimes we associate that next question where we start to then try to dream up, how could this be different? We don't see that as sophisticated or smart or intelligent. That's like naive, you know, that's what you do outside of school. But what I want to say is we need to bring that conversation into educational spaces to say, let's figure out what's harmful, sharpen our vocabulary and insight. Because part of what I was critiquing up there was the fact that most of the people that are creating the digital infrastructures and worlds that we have to navigate and inhabit, they have a very fuzzy understanding of society and the worlds that they're creating these tools for. We have to sharpen that and understand it more precisely and then say, so then what do we do about this, right? Both in policy and technology, et cetera. And so that's my roundabout way of saying, I think whatever's challenging that you find challenging, I think that's pervasive. Everyone is dealing with that kind of the distraction, the hype, all of the things that distort our vision. And I think though you have more motivation and investment in doing something about it because you're going to be on this planet longer, right? So in my view, you have like the energy and the motivation to not just be complacent and accept what is, because you have a stake and this is the world that you have to live in, and in that way you have to lead. And I think that's why you're here today.
Thank you. Any other question? Okay, down there too. If you could introduce yourself with your name and maybe where you're from.
Okay. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. My name is Mimi, and I'm with Where You Connect. And my question for you is, how do you think we could get teens to think more creatively instead of critically?
Yes. Thank you. I think we need both first. It's not an either or, because if you just jump to being creative without doing the critical work, then you're often going to be creating things that don't match reality, are not connected, like it's in a different, like it's like that guy with his astronaut suit swimming in the pool. Like that's being creative with no groundedness in reality, right? So we need the criticality, but to be creative, in my view, the responsibility of educators and educational systems is to bring that into the classroom, bring that into the curriculum. It shouldn't be something extra, something on the side, something you do after school. Too often the first things to go in our educational system are the two places where you develop that capacity: art, recess. Cut. One of the things that I talk about in the book Imagination is looking at the role of play, not as something that is like just to get your energy out, but play as a site of knowledge and development. It's essential to us as human beings. right? And what I learned in writing about play and following and learning from play scholars, yes, there's a such thing, play scholar, in case anybody wants to go that route, who study play and gain these insights, is one, young people will play by any means necessary. No matter if we're doing all this cutting, they're going to find a way to play. So you might as well incorporate it into the pedagogy, right? So much of the things that are seen as bad or, you're not following the rules, that's the urge, the desire for play to be taken seriously, right? The other thing is when we look at different countries and the way that they organize their educational systems, countries like Finland that take play seriously, in which the students, they don't even really focus on math and reading and stuff until they're a bit older because they take play so seriously. The teachers are literally like studying the kids' play and figuring out what, how they're learning about cooperation, collaboration, competition, communication, all these things. And they're taking it seriously and building it like a feedback loop into the pedagogy, is that those students, when we do these country by country tests to rank countries, we love a rank, boy. Rank countries, the students in Finland who haven't been focused so obsessively, don't do standardized testing, they have lots of breaks and recess all the way up through school, those students out-test everybody else. So the idea, this inverse relationship between focusing on creativity and play actually makes you like just knock these little still silly tests right out the box, right? Like they're like, what's this little thing? Boom, done, number one, right? And so taking it seriously, again, this is a call for those of us who are funding programs, thinking about education. And it's not something, again, either or, where we're either doing STEM or that we're either doing arts. Like, part of the issue is that we need to be more integrative and holistic in our thinking to understand how these really should be in coordination with one another, infused. There's so much creativity in the sciences. It's not called that, right? But there's so much imagination. The last thing I'll say, different context. When I was doing my first book project as a graduate student, I was studying scientists and looking at the way that they worked in their labs, specifically working in stem cell research, regenerative medicine. And so many of the people that I would talk to and observe and get interviews, they would always trace their interest in science and biotechnology in particular to something that they experienced as a young person that was like science fiction. A movie they watched, a TV show, Star Trek came up again and again and again, right? So again, their imagination around the sciences and biotechnologies were incited through these fictional accounts of what the future could be. So they traced their origin story as scientists to the arts, which tells us how essential that is, and yet we don't take it seriously. Like, if we're being honest, there's a hierarchy of knowledge and fields where we have the so-called hard stuff at the top, the soft social sciences, the humanities, and way underground are arts. And we have to be real with that. Even when we're talking about interdisciplinarity, there's still a hierarchy. And we need to completely upend that, because essentially we're suffering the consequences of that hierarchy in the fact that we have all of these technologies and tools that were developed by people who were told all of their educational system, you're the best, you're the smartest. And yet they don't know shit about all of these other layers, right? And so that's a problem. And that's a problem. That is part of the hubris that infects, the world that we live in, these so-called titans and know-it-alls, is because they were fed that lie that they know everything and they can solve the future for us, and yet there's such a lack of depth in their knowledge. So again, we in this room and those in our fields, we have the capacity to begin to really transform this ecosystem of knowledge and insight and really prioritize creativity, imagination, and the arts, not just for the art students, but infusing it into everything across the board.
Thank you. Right here, in the middle. Do we have a mic? Okay.
I'm Markel with Royal Youth Connect, and I say I like the slides that you showed because it really shows how the government and the system push the narrative of for most colored people and people in poverty to be quote unquote high risk, and the algorithm forced us to be high risk. And I just got a question, like, is there any tips you would give to the youth to break the algorithm?
Ooh, that's a question. Look, that's a question we have to have, a conversation we have to have off the camera. Because I do have thoughts, but like, you can't give away all your secrets. If you're about to break an algorithm, you don't want it to be broadcast, all right? But truly, that is, it's about breaking, but it's also creating the kinds of context that you want also. I think language is a technology. Technologies aren't just like these things, right? Language is a technology. So how we name things and call things, and how we allow ourselves to be named and called, there's a certain power in that. So when we talk about this whole language about high risk or at risk, that's a technology that's wielding a certain power and often boxing us into a category that even when we're told, oh, this is to help you, we know it's not to help us, it's to control us. And so as a starting point, what you can do, what we can all do, is to be much more cognizant of the language, the technology that we're wielding to name people, to name processes. One of my colleagues, Victor Rios, he's a professor out at Santa Barbara. He used to be a gang member when he was a youth, and he got rerouted. He had wonderful mentors. He eventually got his doctorate, and he started studying gang processes. And one of the shifts in language that he proposes, he says, it's not about being at risk, it's about being at promise. These are at promise youth that we're talking about, to shift our analysis and thinking about how we then engage. You engage someone who's risky differently than you engage someone who has promise, right? That's a technology that we can all begin to do yesterday that can shift us into a parallel reality that doesn't rely on these racialized categories of riskiness and instead looks at the potential and the capacity of the people that we're engaging and shifts the power dynamics in the process.
Thank you. I think we had a question here in the middle.
Hello, my name is Brianna Marie, and I am an intern for the Reimagine Black Youth Mental Health Initiative. And one of my questions that I had for you is, what advice do you have for dealing with people who are like the rainbow bench? They have all the right images and they're showing you all these wonderful things, but it's like I don't think some of them always realize that what they're doing can be extremely harmful. And then for the ones that do realize, how do we kind of stop that and step in and say no?
Favorite question. I haven't had anyone be like, no, the bench is a person. Okay, that's very astute because we've all engaged a rainbow bench person for sure. Yes, I think there's not a formulaic answer. I think recognizing that is a phenomenon is an important first step, right? I think just through my own experience, I think one of the things that we have to develop to be able to effectively sort of engage that kind of dynamic, that person where it's all talk, no substance, is to be willing to be seen as a troublemaker, to be willing to be seen as not being a team player, to operate in institutions without becoming institutional, right? And so we can move in these spaces, we can work in an organization, but we have a lot of language around, we want to have increased belonging. We want to belong, we want to feel, I don't want to belong. I don't want to belong. Because what I'm being asked to belong into is something that I feel needs to be changed, dramatically transformed. So when we belong, then we become the face of things and we become the rainbow, honestly. We become the rainbow. That is to say, they use our faces and our presence in order to carry on business as usual by saying, look at how diverse it is. And yet we're still going to be policing your neighborhoods. We're still going to be surveilling this. We're still going to be, and so we have to be very careful that we don't become the rainbow bench, because that's often the case in all this diversity and inclusion shift, right? And so I would say, again, operating on, but always like having one foot outside, where you don't identify with this thing so completely that you're unwilling to call things out. We should always be positioned in such a way that we understand, our job, our accountability is not to a particular, title or particular institution, but it's really to these ideals, of a kind of world that we don't necessarily can experience right now in our lifetimes, but we're doing our part to make that come about. And I don't think we can do that if we identify too strongly with how things currently are, And so, again, like, just be comfortable with just being seen as, oh, here she come again. What's she gonna say this time? Like, just own that, as just like, this is what your responsibility is to make people feel a little like, maybe we shouldn't say that around her.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. So do we have someone ready? In the front, right here, in the front of the room. Could we get a mic up front?
Oops, leave it.
Hello, my name is Keisha Lisette, and I'm with Black Youth Reimagine. My question is, people of color, they're clearly at a disadvantage and subject to inequities when it comes to education, and we aren't being taken seriously. How is it, like when the time comes and it's like in the moment, how do we confront like the educator when they're not taking us seriously?
Yes, like your own teacher?
Yes.
Yes.
We go back.
Yes. Great question. Like, again, that's like one of those things in the situation, the dynamic. So much depends on your relationship with that person, how you're going to engage. Is there a relationship? Is there a sense that they will listen to you and be receptive or not? So much of the change that we need has to rely on a certain kind of accountability and relationship. And oftentimes we don't even have that basic, thing. With that, I would say, in my view, confronting, challenging anyone is easier and better done, not simply as a lone individual, but as a group. So oftentimes, whether in the workplace or in schools, it's important to look to your left and right and see who else is experiencing this, who else, can be with me and have my back. It could be another teacher. It could be a student club, but part of it is to not feel like you have to do things alone. It's so important to find your crew, to find your, that even if they're not physically there, like, okay, if something happens, they will have my back, and I'm saying this not sort of idealistically, I'm dealing with this now in my own institution where faculty are being targeted by the administration for supporting students who've been engaged in protests against this genocide. And one of the things we had to do is we had to find each other. Like, we can't let them peel us apart and deal with it individually. We have to get together and work on it together. Get a pro bono lawyer together in our case, right? And so it's important just to have, it can be just a few other people, but find your people, because it's so much easier to do anything challenging where it makes you nervous or makes you feel like you're vulnerable when you have other people with you, right? And that's an important, then you decide together how to approach it and navigate it based on those circumstances. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Does someone have the last question for Dr. Benjamin over here?
I'm Lavender. I'm with the St. Paul Youth Commission Board. My question is kind of on the last two questions. So how to be that person that's like, oh, here she comes again, and try to when they try to push you out or just make it so exhausting to exist in that space when you don't have any, body to band with.
Yes, that's real. That's real. I think there's kind of a preventative thing, and then there's something that to think through after. I mean, preventatively, I do think we have to understand that we're doing this work for the long haul. Like, we have to guard against burning out and trying to do everything ourselves. Like, that itself is a kind of hubris where we think we are the saviors. We're not the saviors, We're doing our part, like those little bees, and we have to allow other people to do their part. That means that in your own life and how you allocate your time and energy, you have to do things that are sustaining for you, that aren't always in battle mode or challenging mode, because that is depleting, right? So you have to do that. And again, we have ways of thinking about this is not either or. You have to fill yourself, whatever that looks like for you. But I also think we need to discern when we've reached a limit where we feel like we can't do any more here. They're not going to listen to us. They're not going to take us seriously. So, again, being discerning in what we're trying to do to say, I got to leave, I got to quit, I got to move on, I got to put my energies elsewhere, whatever that looks like. It's like not feeling like a quitter, but knowing when you've reached a limit. Some things are just not going to change. Some people are just not going to. We just have to wait for them to die out, like literally, right? And so that's another thing, is just like being okay with that, that bit. There's one other thing I was going to share with you. It just slipped my mind. Yeah, but what was it? It's too many parts to my response. Do we have time for one more, or is that last one? Maybe one more, and then we'll wrap. Maybe that thought will come back to me. Thanks for that question.
Right here. Great.
Go for it.
My question was, my name is Darius, and I'm here with Worldviews Connect. But my question is, as a youth leader dealing with other youth and adolescents, emotions, how can I cope and handle that in a professional way, in a way that I'm not wrong, or in a way that I'm making a situation better, coping with his or her emotion and also my emotion? For I won't snap out as a youth leader or like burn out dealing with all these different emotions, with also coping with my emotions.
Yes, I appreciate that. That's such a just honest reflection. And it comes back to this idea that the healers need healing. The leaders need to be led. Like, we can't always be in the position of having to have things all put together. We also need a context and the places just to lay things bare and to be our full selves, So really being diligent about that. You can't always be in that one mode where you have to hold it all together and suppress your emotions. The other thing is, emotions are a form of knowledge. People are scared of emotion, whether it's anger or fear or crying, whatever it is. I think part of it is we have to build our capacity to recognize emotion is a form of insight. It's a way of communicating in a way that just regular reasoned language doesn't necessarily. But we live in an enlightenment context where these things have been pit against each other. Mind, body, right? And so we think of things that have to do with the heart and emotion as lesser. It's associated with women. It's associated with people of color, right? The angry black woman trope, right? But that anger is a form of insight and knowledge that shouldn't be suppressed. We should be asking, what is that emotion trying to teach us and tell us? Let's engage it rather than try to suppress it or manage it or control it or put it on detention or suspend it, right? And so part of it is all of us need to build that capacity to engage other people and our own full range of emotion as part of what it means to be human, And so, but it shouldn't just be something that's on your shoulders. We should be asking the organizations that we work in, the schools that we work in, to really question how they try to suppress emotion and how they think of emotion as deviant or something wrong. Because it's something that, as a culture, we have a very hard time dealing with. It's not just individually. So it really is raising an issue that I think we can all begin to transform our thinking around and understand that it's gendered, it's raced, it's class, like who we think of as too emotional. Like if I put too emotional, what kinds of people do we associate with that? That tells us a lot about how we think of emotion too, right? And we need to recalibrate all of that. Thank you for that question.
I think we're at time. I just want to do two things real quick. One is, could you please join me in thanking Dr. Benjamin for this incredible conversation? So much, yes. So much wisdom, so much knowledge, so much heart. I think we are fueled to go on today. The second thing I want to give is to the young people in the room. Please join me in thanking. Because I have the mic for another 30 seconds, there are a couple of lessons that we heard. I think there are many lessons. A couple of things that I'm going to take away right away. One is, let's interrogate our language, right? It's a technology. Let's make sure we're not the rainbow bench. I'm going to take that to heart. The second is that we really need to interrogate our origin story in philanthropy and who we are and where we come from. That's another important lesson that I'm taking away from today. And then the third one is that we have to be like the bees, the honeybees. Break out of our silos and our binaries, work together, do it for the next generation, right? Not wait for results, not claim success as our own. And so in the book, in the last chapter, there's this incredible passage, and I was going to read it, and of course I thought, no, this is the moment to give the book back to its author. And if you, we talked about this earlier, here's the passage.
It's a short passage, so I'll just read it as a closing. So in his book, Honeybee Democracy, Professor of Biology Thomas Seeley confirms, honeybees make decisions collectively and democratically. Every year, faced with the life or death problem of choosing and traveling to a new home, honeybees stake everything on a process that includes collective fact-finding, vigorous debate, and consensus building. Not only do bees teach us that collaboration is how we survive, that decision-making should be collective, that we each have a part to play in creating a livable ecosystem, but also that we don't have to choose between working hard and creating beautiful, sweet things.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Beverly Ross Denny, and I'm the Managing Director with Grantmakers for Education. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Youth Prize President Marcus Pope, Dr. Benjamin, and our Board Vice Chair Sophie Finelli for the thoughtful discussion we had this morning. If we use our imagination to think collectively and democratically about our education, we have the capacity to move towards a more inclusive future where everyone can engage in lifelong learning and thrive. I'm excited to share that we will continue this conversation with our youth community leaders from across Minnesota. We believe they are the next generation of philanthropists, and we're facilitating a workshop with them this morning. We will learn more about their career aspirations and hopefully encourage them to pursue careers in philanthropy. If you happen to meet one of them over the course of the day, please stop to greet them and welcome them to the conference. I'd also like to take this time to invite you to attend a special dance performance at 5:10 p.m. in Salons A and B, as well as the funder reception scheduled for this evening starting at 5:45 p.m. right here at the hotel. Our hosts this year are the Carnegie Corporation of New York, William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, National PTA, Spring Point Partners, and Wildflower Foundation. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.